Hello everyone, my name is Vivek. I am a software developer. I make videos about containers, Kubernetes, Go as a programming language, and sometimes about software engineering in general. So, if you have been liking the kinds of videos that I make, maybe you should consider subscribing to the channel. In this particular video, we are going to talk about what are Kubernetes service accounts, how do we create them, and things like that. So let's say we have a Kubernetes cluster up and running, and if we talk about how many users or what kinds of users this particular Kubernetes cluster can have, there are basically two kinds. The very first kind would be normal users uh, that want to talk to this particular Kubernetes cluster to do certain things. For example, Kubernetes administrators or Kubernetes developers who want to, let's say, develop something or administer something on this particular Kubernetes cluster. The other kinds of users would be, or the other kinds of clients, we can say clients because we are eventually going to talk to or call the Kubernetes API server. So the other kind of clients or other kind of use would be by the programs or by the processes that are running inside your Kubernetes cluster. So let's just go ahead and try to call them application. So now we see that we have two kinds of users. First one are real, let's say real humans or persons that are going to talk to Kubernetes API server to do certain things, and the other kinds of users are, I would say, the programs, applications or processes that are running in your Kubernetes cluster, and they want to talk to the Kubernetes API server. So if we talk about this particular use case where a particular person wants to talk to Kubernetes API server, in that particular case, uh, management of the users, this kind of users, is not actually supported by Kubernetes itself. So using Kubernetes, we cannot actually create users, delete users. So these are all the things that we cannot do using Kubernetes. We don't have any Kubernetes API to support that. But if we do talk about of access of API server from the applications or the processes, we can manage this using this Kubernetes resource called service account. So for example, let's say you want to run your application on Kubernetes that is eventually obviously going to run as a pod. So let's say from inside a pod you want to talk to Kubernetes API server. Service account is actually the resource that is responsible to specify which kind of privilege this particular application has, and things like that. So now that we have a very basic understanding of Kubernetes, if we talk about how service sorry now that we have very basic understanding of service accounts, if we talk about how Kubernetes service accounts are created, so there are some controllers running as part of Kubernetes controller manager, and those controllers are actually responsible to create a default service account on every namespace of Kubernetes cluster. So for example, let's say if we create a namespace named, let's say, test, there is a controller, there would be a controller running as part of Kubernetes controller manager that is going to make sure that a service account named default is actually created in this particular namespace. So this is how a default service account is created. Now if you want to create your own service account, you are free to do that, and we are going to look into how we can create that as well. Now, since we discussed, or since we already have set up a basic understanding that this default service account or any service account is going to specify which kind of privilege the application has, because this particular particular service account is going to be used by, so for example, let's say we have this namespace named test, and we have created, or the controller has by default created this default service account here. Now if I try to run a pod in this particular namespace, as we have already discussed, this particular service account is already or automatically going to be used in this particular pod. So if we don't specify any service account for the pod that we are going to run, the default service account of the namespace is going to be used inside the pod that we are going to run. And once we have default service account in this particular pod, if we try to run, let's say, kubectl get something, the access that is specified for this particular service account is going to be used when this particular application tries to talk to API server. So for example, let's say we have API server running here. If this particular pod, let's say, asks for all the pods from specific namespace, it totally depends if the service account that has been mounted on this particular pod has that privilege or not. So yeah, I mean, this is the basic overview or basic use case of service accounts. So again, if I try to summarize that, if your program, your application that you are going to run as eventually as part of Kubernetes pod wants to talk to Kubernetes API server, in that case you would want to specify a service account. And if you don't specify a service account, a default service account is used, and that default service account gets created automatically when we create a namespace, and it gets created automatically using or by this controller, service account controller, that runs as part of Kubernetes controller manager. Now if we talk about, let's say, this specific default service account, so as we said, this service account actually has details about the privilege that using which this particular application is going to connect to API server. Or in other words, we can say that this service account would actually have the authentication details. And to have those authentication details, we know that in case of Kubernetes, we use secret resources to store some confidential information. So the authentication details would obviously be confidential information. So that is the reason service account actually always refers to one or many secrets. So in this particular case, let's say it refers to a secret named default and something. Now if this is the secret that is actually going to have authentication details or credentials to talk to the API server. And yeah, we are going to look into that in a bit. If we just go ahead and try to, let's say, create a service account just to see that default, sorry, if I just go ahead and try to create a namespace test, we would be able to see a service account on this particular namespace by default. So get service accounts, and we can see that this service account was created 53 minutes ago, because we are getting the service account from default namespace, and we just created test namespace. So get service account from test namespace, and we can see that this default service account was just created. Now as we discussed already, this service account is actually going to refer to a secret, and that secret is actually going to have authentication details. So if we describe the service account from test namespace named default, we can see that the secret that it refers to is default token and something. If I get all the secrets from test namespace, so this is the secret that is actually going to contain the authentication detail. So let's just go ahead and try to look into the details of that secret. So this particular secret has actually three fields inside data: ca.cert, namespace, and token. So namespace is obviously the namespace this service account is part of. So if we just go ahead and decode that, we should be able to see test namespace. Now if we talk about ca.cert field here, this is actually certificate authority that is being used for your Kubernetes API server. So if we set up our Kubernetes clusters using Kubedium, in that case the PKI related, or let's say certificate related things are actually stored in this directory named etc Kubernetes and PKI, and we can actually make sure, or we can actually confirm that by describing kube API server pod, because we do pass that as a flag. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to make sure that this particular CA certificate that is specified here is actually same to what Kubernetes API server is using. So if I edit pod from kube system namespace named kube API server, and if we look into the CA cert that is being used, so this is the CA cert. So etc Kubernetes PKI ca.cert, and to actually get this, since we are on kind cluster, it simply means that everything is running on this particular node. So let's exec into that. So what we are trying to get is, we are actually trying to get the CA cert that is being used for Kubernetes API server, and we would make sure that the same CA cert is present in the secret that is referred by service account. So cd into etc Kubernetes PKI, and if we ls-l, this is the certificate that we are talking about. Now so API ca.cert, let's just copy everything from here and paste here. So API ca.cert is actually CA cert that is being used by the API server. Now if we just go ahead and get the secret once again, and we will have to decode it, because we know that in case of secret the data is stored as base 64 encoded strings. So echo base 64 -d, and this is the actual data. We are going to call it service account ca.cert. And now if we just go ahead and try to see difference between these two files, we should not be able to see any difference, and here we go. So diff would return if there was any difference between those two files. So yeah, now that we know CA cert is actually the cert that is being used by API server, namespace is the namespace, token is actually JWT token, encrypted JWT token, that is going to be used, that is going to be passed to the API server when we try to talk to talk to API server. So yeah, these are all the details that the secret contains, the secret that is being referred by service account. So now if we go back to this diagram once again, we can see here service account is actually service account does have the details that can be used to talk to Kubernetes API server. Now, if I say kubectl get pods, everything related to authentication and authorization is being done using kubeconfig. But if I just hit API server directly, so for example, if we let's figure out where our API server is running. So to do that, we will have to look into kubeconfig file, and this is where our server is running. So curl -insecure, and it simply says we are not allowed to access the API server. Okay, now we know that the service account can be used to talk to API server. So let's just look into how we can actually do that. So first of all, we will have to get the token that the service account has. So get secrets -n test -o YAML, and let's decode this particular token. And we are going to make the same request, but this time we are going to specify the token that we have. Okay, and this percentile that we have here, it is not actually part of the output. This is something wrong with the shell that I'm using, so I'm going to remove that. And we can see here we are actually able to access or talk to Kubernetes API server. Earlier we were having 403, but now we are actually able to talk to API server. So this simply means if we have a service account created, and this service account is actually eventually, let's say, referring to a secret, and we want to talk to Kubernetes API server. This is API server from this particular pod. If we somehow mount, or if we somehow use this service account into this particular pod, this pod or the program that is running in this pod would be able to talk to API server, because we just saw the content of secret or the content of service account can be used to talk to API server, and that is what I'm trying to explain here. So if this service account can be used inside pod, which actually happens automatically if we don't specify service accounts manually. So default service account would be used here, and we would be able to talk to the Kubernetes API server. Now if we go into a bit more detail about how this service account, or how the things that we looked into, for example ca.cert, namespace and token, are actually used in the pod. So let's just go ahead and try to exit into the pod. So first of all, let's run a pod in test namespace, and once we have the pod running, exec it test and pod name bash. So we created the namespace, service account was actually mounted into the pod, When a service account gets mounted into the pod, it simply means that the data that was there in the secret is mounted at a specified location, and that location is where run secrets. So if we cd into var run secrets, we would be able to see the things. So yeah, these are the three fields that the secret has. If we get the secret once again, ca.cert, namespace, and token. So, and these are the fields that are mounted inside the pod at location var run secrets Kubernetes IO service account. If we, let's say, cat token, we should be able to see decoded version of this value. Similarly, if we cat namespace, we should be able to see test here. So yeah, I mean, now that we are sure, or we know how a service account, default service account, is created, how it gets mounted into a pod, the other thing that we should talk about is, for example, let's say if we have a closer look into this particular pod. So let's say this is the pod, and inside this particular pod var run secrets Kubernetes service accounts, or let's say this, at this particular location we have all the details about CSRT token and everything. Now if our application wants to talk to API server, this particular application is actually going to create a client. So it would say, let's say I used Go as a programming language to write this application. So we are going to say, in Go, we are going to use Kubernetes client of Go programming language, and we would say get me client. And in that particular case, Kubernetes client for Go is actually set up in such a way that it is going to by default look at this particular directory to get the details about authentication mechanism. So yeah, I think now things should make sense. So service account would get created, that would be used by default inside a pod if we don't specify any service account manually, and the application that we are running inside the pod is actually by default going to look for the directory where the secrets are, where the secret is mounted. So now that we have, I would say, good understanding of how secret is created, how we can actually, how the application uses them. If we talk about what are all the accesses that the default service account has. So if we let's say run a pod kubectl run, I'm going to call it kctl, and the image is going to be bit nowme/kubectl, and in test namespace. So this pod actually completes, and we don't want to do that. So let's just go ahead and try to add some sleep into this particular pod. So it says this cannot be changed. So I'm going to create deployment, and then maybe we can edit the command there. And here we are going to specify command for the container, and this command is just going to sleep for, let's say, this second. Don't worry about the pod manifest here. Let's just assume we are running a pod with kubectl in it. Okay, and now we have a pod running kubectl, and by now it should be clear that this particular pod would have default service account uh, attached, and eventually the contents of secret would be mounted at a specific location inside the pod. So if we just go ahead and try to give, let's say, pods. So yeah, this is another thing that I wanted to talk about. So here, if we say kubectl get pods, this actually is, this kubectl here is actually going to use the details that, or the authentication, the details that are specified in var run secrets that we have just seen. If we, I think, specify v6 here, we should be able to see the details that are being used for authentication. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I am not able to, yeah, so what I was saying is I'm not able to verify, I'm not able to look into the logs to make sure that var run secrets is used, but if we look into this particular message, it simply says that the user that is being used here is service account. The name of the service account is default from the namespace test. So it simply means that the authentication details that are specified in var run secrets directory are actually being used here. So if we talk about default access, by default we would be able to figure out what are all the API resources, what are all the API endpoints that are exposed by default. So if I say kubectl API resources, we should be able to see the output. So in other words, we can say that by default the default service account that gets created is actually able to list, or is actually able to figure out what are all the API resources that are running inside the cluster. Now the other thing that I wanted to talk about is, if we look into this particular error message, so the service account that is being used here, and it is being figured out from the directory that we have already looked into, var run secrets, Kubernetes, etc. And this is how the format of the user looks like in case of service account. So even though we are using service account, it is being treated as, eventually being treated as user, and the format is system colon service account colon namespace and then name of the service account. So yeah, and we also looked into what are all the privileges that the default service account already has. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, let's say you want to create a pod, but you don't want the default service accounts credentials to be mounted inside that pod. So what you can do is, we already have a manifest here. We can see in the pod manifest we are specifying auto mount service account token to be false. So it simply means if I create this pod, the service account token would not be mounted inside the pod. So let's just go ahead and try to create this pod. And if we exit into here, we should not be able to see the directory that we have already seen, var run secret. So cd var run, and here we go. We don't see any directory named secrets here. But if we exit into the other pods that are running on other namespaces where we have not specified auto mount service account token to be false, we should be able to see that directory. So bash, and here we go. So yeah, this is, and the similar field can also be specified for service account as well. So for example, if I create a service account and specify auto mount service account token for that service account to be false, in that case that service account is not actually will not be mounted on the pods that are going to be created. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, for example, let's say if we look into the secret that gets created, the type of the secret is Kubernetes IO service account token. So it simply means that we can go ahead and try to create this secret by ourselves as well. So it's totally fine if we create the secret ourselves. It's just that to refer the service account from secret, or the vice versa, what we will have to do is we will have to annotate the secret with the service account name. So if we get the secret, we should be able to see an annotation. So this is the annotation here. So service account dot name default, and the type should be service account token. So if we keep these two things in mind, we can very well create this secret by ourselves. But we wouldn't actually ever do that, I think, because we just go ahead and try to create service accounts and this secret gets created automatically. Now let's go ahead and try to look into how we can create a custom service account. To do that, what we have to do is we just have to say create service account and then name of the service account, and that is pretty much it. So create service account, custom service account, and if we look into all the service accounts, we can see that custom service account has been created, and a respective secret would also have been created. So secrets, here we go, custom SA token and something. So now if we have created a custom service account, we would actually want to provide it or give it some specific or some additional privileges. So if we again go back and look into this particular diagram, if we talk about default service account, it was, and if it was being used by a pod, this particular pod was just able to figure out what are all the API endpoints or API resources that are exposed by API server. But if we have created a custom service account, we would actually want to give it some additional privileges, so that if this particular custom SA is being used by a pod, that pod is able to do some other things. For example, let's say this pod should be able to list all the deployments from XYZ namespace. So All these things can be done using some other Kubernetes resources that we are going to look into some other videos. And those resources are roles, cluster roles, role bindings, and cluster role bindings. So yeah, I mean, this was pretty much it about Kubernetes service accounts. If you have any questions, just let me know, maybe in the comments, or we can talk about things on Twitter as well. Follow me on Twitters. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for watching.